Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are free and open to the public, and we encourage you to attend. They're most Sundays at noon, except during July and August. Today, I am honored to introduce our speaker, Reid. He's one of my favorite writers. I first began tracking and appreciating his writings back in the 1970s. Today he's going to talk about his new book, a relatively new book on Ann Richards. And the title of his book is Let the People In. Very appropriate. The Life and Times of Ann Richards. His book is based on his long personal friendship with Ann, interview with her friends and associates, and her correspondence with Bud Shrake, and extensive research. He's giving us a real insider's perspective that we probably can't get anywhere else. As you know, Governor Richards created opportunities for women and minorities in government service, promoted the development of health and human services, safety net in Texas, and pushed for economic growth benefiting all the people, not just a wealthy few. She advanced the cause of human rights for all Texans with an inimitable style, wit, and compassion. She was a forceful person. Reid has been a senior writer at Texas Monthly for 3 decades and contributes to the New York Times, Esquire, Men's Health, and GQ, among others. He's received awards and recognition for his books on Texas music, the Rio Grande River, the political rise and fall of Tom DeLay, and one of his early books, which was fascinating, is, I think, The Incredible Rise of Redneck Rock, a great book on Texas music. So I'm going to let Reid go ahead and educate us and entertain us for the next 55 minutes. Jan?
Thank you, Bonnie, for remembering almost getting that long title right. It's The Improbable Rise of Redneck Rock, and it was really improbable. Written in 1974. As you said, I was a friend of Ann Richards. I married into that friendship. My wife, Dorothy Brown, had been a younger social friend of hers hands before she got into politics, even at the county level, and then worked for her both when she was as a senior aide, both when she was a treasurer and at the governor's office. I was a volunteer advisor on environmental issues in her 1990 campaign for governor, the one she won, and had the pleasure of working for one of her best appointees, again, in the environmental realm during those 4 years when she was in office. So I did know her, but I would never have dreamed of trying to write a book about Ann until I learned, because someone asked me to contribute to an anthology, I learned that there was this incredible archive of her papers and documents and photographs and videos at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History. It's amazing work that they put together, and they did it so fast. And unlike many politicians, she wanted that to be transparent and open. There were 2 things. Most of the death penalty cases and then some personnel matters were held back. But the rest of it, was open. And once I started pursuing it as the chief archivist, because I'd come across, I was looking at the index. The index was printed out 700 pages, single spaced, just the index. So you can imagine how much there was in it. They would come over 5 or 6 boxes at a time in a truck. We used to know, it's the Balcones Research Center. It's now their state-of-the-art archival place for, materials that shouldn't be lost. But I asked the chief archivist, Evan Hawker, I had come across a few things that said you need the governor's permission or to look at these. I asked her, and she'd passed away in 2006, and this was some years later. I asked him, what did that mean? And he said, let me get back to you. And just a day or two later, he called me. It's just a very happy voice. He said, what she signed, she directed that a year and a half after her passing, everything was to be open to the public and to scholars, journalists, people like me. So that's how I came to have the privilege to take on such a book. I've written 2 novels, one of which I'd like to plug because it also won an award just before this one, a historical novel called Comanche Sundown. And in those two novels, I had several women characters that I devoted a lot of care to. But as it happened in my much more prolific journalism and nonfiction career, I never really had much of a chance to write about women. And so that was both a challenge and a pleasure to immerse myself in the life and times of someone who had such an incredible life. When I met Anne, she was 46. She had just come back from a rehabilitation and for her alcoholism in Minnesota. She was a county commissioner at the time. She had a lot of reasons to be really down on herself and about her prospects. But she was playing bridge in a crowd of people who were just sloshing their drinks away as usual. It didn't bother her a bit, and she just commanded the room. She was bawdy, funny, and I have to say she was sexy as all get out. And so I was 2 or 3 years after that. Dorothy went to work for her at the Treasury, so I saw her quite a bit. We know, most people do know about anything about, just a bit about Ann Richards, is that she was a governor of Texas from 1990 to 1994, and she lost her office to George W. Bush, who used that, pretty soon used that office as a springboard to 2 terms as president. But she had her life from 1933 until she died in 2006 was an amazing journey. She grew up first in a very small rural place outside Waco. She went to high school there. She married her high school sweetheart, David Richards, who went on to be and continues to be a noted labor lawyer first, and his specialty moved toward voting rights and civil rights. He's an amazing person. He was extremely helpful to me, as were her 4 children. In writing this book, it wasn't an quote authorized biography, but they did everything they could to help, and they also got early looks at it and they had some remarks to make and correction errors that were made. I was very glad to have that input. I consider David and her 4 children, Cecile, Clark, Dan, and Ellen, great friends for many years. But they spent a decade in Dallas, and it was a pretty unhappy time in Ann's life because she was 19, 20 when she married, and at the time, what a woman did then was start having babies, and she found that very difficult. She had four children, most in that period, all in that period. There was one time when they left Dallas. They were entranced by the new frontier, and so David got a position with the newborn Civil Rights Commission, which had been created by President Eisenhower. He soon found out that Civil Rights Commission did not have the authority to do very much at all, and that the Kennedy administration was really not prepared to take on that early in his first term. She came away with. They both came. They left after a year and went back to Dallas, partly because the social gossiping and maneuvering and affairs, and who might have had an affair and who wasn't, was off-putting. And there was one time when she and David, as 20, in her late 20s, were at a birthday party for a woman who was on Lyndon Johnson's staff, and much to their surprise, Lyndon Johnson, who was then vice president, just appeared at this small birthday party, and they were all didn't know what to say. David tried to make some conversation, and he mentioned a story that had been in the Texas Observer that he thought was complimentary to Mr. Johnson. And Johnson launched into this tirade because he knew how much Ronnie Tucker and the Texas Observer disliked him, and he disliked him just as much. And David recalls it that none of his friends stepped up to help. It was all the ire was directed at him, and Ann said it's the only time apparently that Ann admitted to being cowed by anyone. In Washington, she also, a decade later, she also got a chewing out by Jimmy Carter. And so she was not drawn to Washington politics, but it turned out that Washington was drawn to her. In the jockeying she won 2 terms as treasurer. The second one pretty effectively unopposed. But it was a small agency that has since been consolidated in the Comptroller's office. But midway through that, she had to start thinking about what she was going to do. She wasn't going to be treasurer for another term. And probably she might have, at the time, figured in about 4th among potential Democratic candidates for governor in 1990. And that's not counting Republicans who were loaded with talent and had all the money and all the advantage. And so, but she was going to the old Mueller Airport to catch a flight to go talk to bankers somewhere, and checked in with their office. They said, you need to call these people at the Democratic National Committee. And shortly after that, she called her longtime press secretary, Bill Cryer, and he was visiting his parents in Louisiana. And she said, "Bill, I'm going to tell you something you'd never believe." And he said, "What's that, Aunt?" She said, "I've just been asked to deliver the keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention." And he was laughing. He said, "Well, you're right. I never would have believed that." And she was laughing too. And she said, "Well, I don't believe it either, but I'm not going to turn them down. You need to get back over here right away." So she spent several weeks then trying to prepare for this speech to take place in Atlanta. Someone got her to take on a big-time speechwriter in Washington because it was one of the few times she didn't trust the people who were closest to her. And so it was this, she had an idea, thought she'd know how to start and close the speech, but they kept switching that back and forth. And they're burning up fax machines, and she felt it was just getting farther and farther away from what she wanted to say. And she was also aware that these very close friends of hers were getting pretty sick of her because we're obsessing over this. And just before they left for Atlanta, they got a call from a Washington speechwriter, and the computer had eaten their speech, and it was not going to be retrieved. So they got to Atlanta, and there was this huge crowd of press. She said, at first it was sort of intimidating and off-putting because who am I? But then she said she came to realize, well, that's just part of the way it goes now. So she would be, during a week or so during those days, she would be having appointments with press and politicians in Washington. And at night, she and her closest friends, closest staff, worked on the speech throughout the night. And so when the time came, she I don't know if it was just instinctive or someone told her, but blue is the color for television. Blue just jumps out on television. So she had been given this great dress, a great blue dress, and because she had the hair that, incidentally, that she had created that persona when she first got into politics, because prior to that, she'd had the hairdo of an Earth Mother, and it was Mary Tyler Moore. But she thought, the folksy grandmother, that won't work. So that became part of her persona, the silver hair. But she went out there thinking that they might get, she and her writers thought there might be 10 or 15 applause lines. And there were 40. One of her sons, Dan, said they were off in the wings, and said at one point she picked up a glass of water and her hand was shaking so badly she set it back down. But there was none of that anxiety and nervousness apparent in the delivery of the speech. It's the line that most remembered and followed her through her political career. It's where she said, "Poor George, he can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth." And that became the tagline. There were many. Another one of, she opened with a thing about Ginger Rogers was doing everything Fred Astaire was, except she was dancing backward in high heels. That's how she kicked it off. Sort of the midpoint through the speech, she was criticizing the Reagan administration for the Iran-Contra affair was going on, and there was a scandal over spending at the Pentagon, which, of course, is always the case. Fighter planes that never get made, billions of dollars spent. And she was saying that it was always, I can't hear or I don't remember. And the line in her speech, which I saw in all its drafts, that she went through it and that, and then it was written, somebody written, and so we have concern. And she had slashed through that, and her big hand had substitute. And that old dog won't hunt. As it turned out, that speech, she went out to a political unknown nationally, and walked off the stage of television superstar, and it vaulted her into contention to run for any office she desired. But that speech was also about Michael Dukakis' campaign went pretty much downhill from that speech onward. But Ann was a good soldier, and she and David had divorced after almost 30 years in 1983. And he and she had gathered friends, madcap friends of writer friends of Butch Reid and Gary Cartwright, and others of that pretty wild set in the 70s and 80s. But she and Bud had corresponded occasionally, and he would give her money, whenever she had a campaign. He would give her money because he was one of the few writers in this town who ever had any money. But so they started this. When she got this piece, that's what they started this correspondence. And both their lives were so hectic and frantic they couldn't do it with stamps and envelopes, and neither one could be called on the phone. But they realized that faxes were enable them to communicate in real time. And so from that point in 1988 till toward the end of her term, and then somebody invented email. So the end of their correspondence is somebody figuring out how to retrieve that. But share one. They were both so funny and smart, and irreverent, and about themselves too. But during that, when she was being a good soldier and out there for the Dukakis-Benson campaign, she wrote one of her faxes to Bud when, "Dear Bud, when we pulled into our parking lot, Western Sizzler and Bowie, I was surprised to see so many law enforcement cars, complete with officers, sheriff, a deputy, Bowie police, a constable. Sheriff Young was really nervous, but I attributed it to his advanced years. Maybe his hearing aids were on the fritz. It turned out that we met at the Sizzler, not because the event was to be held there, but so it could be properly escorted to Bowie by all the aforementioned whirling lights and all. Traffic's not all that heavy in Bowie at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the 4 cars and the pickup that we encountered got right out of the way. A big crowd, 300 or so, was waiting outside Bowie Senior High and the junior high band. The first time they had played together, playing a special rendition of the Yellow Rose of Texas. A piece of red carpet was rolled across the sidewalk, and the contestant in this year's Miss Texas pageant handed me the bouquet. Then I saw the source of Mr. Young's nervousness. 2 kids were holding a 6 by 8 foot sign in red, "Ann Richards, these dogs will hunt." About 8 or 10 good old boys were lined up against the wall, holding the chains and leashes on more than a dozen coonhounds. They had obviously been standing there in the hot sun a long time, if the tongues hanging out of the dogs' mouths were any evidence. I made a commitment on the spot to come back and go coon hunting as soon as the campaign is over. After the mayor presented me with a Bowie knife mounted on a board, I made a stirring speech to the Montague County Retired Teachers Association. And you think I'm not having fun? I'd like to see you, Ann. Well, Ann was some of you remember there was a brutal campaign on the Democratic side in which the favored Jim Maddox was just eventually buried, but just by the force of her following and her personality. But it was an extremely nasty campaign, insults flying back and forth from both camps, and she. When Anna was in her wildest drinking days, she had developed an affection for marijuana, and she was very nervous about that. Partly because she didn't want her parents to know about it. And so anyway, there was one debate between Ann and Jim. Actually, I think there were more debates. The first debate between Ann and Jim Maddox and former Governor Mark White, the reporter asked the question, "Have you ever used illegal drugs?" And she gave it an answer. She delivered an answer that people who are familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous know exactly what she was saying, but that didn't fly that time. She left the stadium with this gauntlet of screaming reporters. Answer the question. And it didn't seem like her campaign was going to survive it. But it did. But by the time she won the runoff against Attorney General Maddox, her approval ratings were in the low 30s. And she was running against a charming West Texas rancher and cowboy, an oil man named Clayton Williams, who had just swept away what was thought to be this very strong Republican field of candidates. He had all the money, and at Labor Day, he had a 27-point lead. But they said but that was when she relaxed and became the candidate that people thought they had seen at that speech in Atlanta. And she was also helped along by Clayton Williams, probably the most extravagant self-destruction in Texas political history. It got to the point right at the end when he made a joke about rape. He said he was going to hit her and hoof her and drag her in the dirt, which is a rodeo expression. And it just they finally tried to get him to stop that, but it was hard. He right at the end he was in College Station and had booked this train ride to Laredo, old style, political train ride, and the reporters were there and were aboard, and they'd been asking him, "Why don't you release your taxes?" And he said, I can tell you one year in 1986 when the whole state was going down, and I was just trying to stay out of bankruptcy and keep a few of my companies alive. And he said, in 1986, I didn't have to pay any income taxes. Well, the law, as the statutes were written, he didn't owe any. But that was not good politics. And his staff tried to solve the matter by opening the bar early to get all the reporters drunk. And then when they got to Laredo, they found out that their hotel reservations on the Texas side of the border had been changed over into Nuevo Laredo, making it almost impossible to call in this story to their editors. But the story didn't get out right at the end, and that was the coup de grace. She, despite being so battered in her personal life, and reputation, she had been saying for a while, and when I'm elected, we're going to gather on my Congress Avenue at the bridge, and we're going to march down there. We're going to take back the government for the people of Texas. Well, 30,000 people from all over the state showed up that cold morning. And it was an amazing procession. And that was the start of, she completely turned that extremely negative impression of her around in about 2 or 3 months. Went from 30% approval to 60%. And she came in very much a reformed governor and a hands-on governor. And she always was a hands-on governor. But there had been a continuing scandal over rates at the Insurance Commission, and all the appointees, all the members of the commission were appointees of Governor Clements, and so they were sitting tight, and they didn't care what she thought. And so, but they found out a legal stratagem that she could put the commission in, I can't remember the legal term, but she could gain control of it and just freeze it if they didn't resign. And what the part that got into the press was one of those commissioners was an Austin banker named James Saxton. But most people who know anything about James Saxton knew him as Jimmy Saxton, who was an electrifying All-American halfback for the University of Texas and Darrell Royal. So it was this immediate face-off between Ann Richards and, quote, the good old boys. And it wasn't Saxton's fault. He quickly, after being hauled into this for a few weeks, said, look, politics that's not my thing. I'm going back into banking where I belong. But she got her way with that. She's remembered for that speech to the Democratic National Convention. But her best speech probably was her first State of the State speech, in which she laid out a very ambitious agenda. When they were planning what to do after she had won, they had come up with something called the Blueprint for Texas, and it had 88 things they were going to try to do, not the 3 or 4 that smart politicians, select. But she got some of what she wanted. One of the things was the regulatory structure of the state of Texas was fragmented. There was an air control board. There was a water commission. Attendant an agriculture commission controlled pesticides, and there was a revolving door problem in which people who the regulators went out, walked through the door, and became employees of the regulator. Well, she put Texas at the time, and this may still be true, jockeyed every time the EPA released a toxic inventory. Texas and Louisiana were always either first or second. So she put a hold on any more permissions for toxic or hazardous waste until some substantial changes were made. And I had the pleasure of being indirectly involved in her administration in that way. I wrote speech on a contract basis. I wrote speeches and research papers for the chairman, John Hall, tall, soft-spoken black man. The only person you'll ever encounter, he'll tell you his hometown is Washington on the Brazos. But they accomplished that. They melded that into the agency that's now called Texas Department of Environmental Quality, and there was a drought. There was fear that the Edwards Aquifer was going to go dry, and that's San Antonio's only water supply. It made substantial progress on that, along with I should say with all these matters with the help of Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, that moved up from the Comptroller's office in 1990. Well, they had been pals at one time, drinking partners. And then when they were both in office, they would have their spats, and then they'd make up. It was partly Ann knew that Bob Bullock knew more about Texas government than anybody. But he came to think that he was doing all the heavy lifting, and she was out being a TV star in New York and Washington. And so the tension between them grew. And more than anything, that I described in the book, I described her term as governor as a parabola. 2 years up, 2 years down. And part of it was because her relationship with Lieutenant Governor Bullock just fragmented. They wouldn't speak to each other. And on top of that, he told, quote, his senators that they couldn't talk to the governor unless the governor's office came through him. So what it meant effectively was that none of the legislation she wanted in the last 2 years of her term was going to get passed. And some of the things that hurt her were certainly not her fault. Among them, who would have thought that Bill Clinton being elected president in 1992, would work to her disadvantage because they were friends. He was a Democrat. He had upset the elder President Bush. But he appointed Lloyd Bentsen, the Texas senator, to his cabinet, and so then Ann discovered that the supposedly deep bench of great talent, the class of '82, ballyhooed class of '82 of the Democrats, she really didn't have a bench. She wasn't going to appoint Jim Maddox because the feelings were too bitter on both their parts. And so she looked at John Sharp, Dan Morales, the Comptroller, and her Attorney General. Mr. Morales just flat didn't like her, and she didn't like him. And neither one of them told her what she wanted to hear about their position on freedom of choice. And so she selected Bob Kruger, a very dignified man, but his best race was 15 years behind him. And so he lost in a rout and that set off the political career of Kay Bailey Hutchison. One of the things I discovered that enthralled me in both in interviews and archives was that Texas had, Bill Clinton had won the bidding that included almost every state to get a super collider put here. He gave them $150 million for seed money, which much more promised. And so Ann had this friend, a wealthy young attorney, who had been with her. And she said that she told him that she wanted him to go to Washington and make sure this thing stayed alive. And furthermore, he was going to do it on his own nickel. She didn't have anything to pay him. So, but he did it, But some funny thing happened. The super collider. It had been part of the reason it went as far as it did was that the defense establishment wanted it to happen. They thought all sorts of possibilities in that, and they didn't want the Soviets to do it. So that was part of the thinking. But then suddenly there was no Soviet Union. And President Clinton's administration was not that enthralled with moving ahead, and Congress's ardor had waned. So then this lawyer Shelton Smith's task became not to keep it going, but to get Texas money back. So the thing worked its way around to a meeting involving the president, and Governor Richards, and Shelton Smith. And they were, and Clinton were great friends, but they were at odds over this. And Shelton said it just got more heated and heated as it went along. They weren't yelling at each other, but he said, Clinton is a great big guy. He flushes when he gets angry, so he turned red. And they were sort of face to face, and she reached over and poked him on the leg, and said, "You owe me money, pal. If you don't pay it back, I'm going to sue you." And this is the guy who's going to do it, pointing at Shelton Smith. And Clinton glowered and said, "Well, how much are you going to sue me for?" And Shelton said, "Well, I don't know for sure, Mr. President. I think it'll be $4 or $5 billion." And which was an extravagant bluff, of course. But Clinton sat there for a while, and then all of a sudden smiled and looked around and said, "Well, Governor, I guess we better get you your money." And they did. So they had that. But she loved being a national star, and some of her advisors were telling her, "You shouldn't run again. Or if you do, you can't go all over the world, and you can't let the media attention in Washington and New York that much." So she did cancel the junkets, but she couldn't let go of being a star. And they found out, of course, George W. Bush was a very fine candidate, and he out-campaigned her. She was a working governor till the end. Not just a campaigner in that. She was tired. She looked tired. And he was a fresh young face. And he was put in his race pretty much by Karl Rove, who's a pretty accomplished political operator, as we've seen. She never thought about running for office again, but she was always involved. She took on some lobbying positions that cost her a good deal of grief. But mainly what she did was she made speeches and about involvement in the political process and women in government. And of course, that's passed on. Her oldest daughter, Cecile, is now the national president of Planned Parenthood. I know some of you have been involved just in that continuing battle as the legislature is now in session. But she decided on when she was one of those people who was always somewhere, always like at the Kennedy assassination. She was waiting in the crowd, waiting for him to make the speech. And one time she was in San Francisco raising money when there was an earthquake, a terrible earthquake. Well, there she was in San Francisco. Well, she happened to be in New York on 9/11, and she saw that there was this young woman from another country. She's another European country. I'm not sure it was, who was just, walking in despair and shock about what had happened to her trip to the United States. And saw what a state she was, and just took her off the street, took her into her apartment, got her settled down, and reassured her. And that was the time when Anne decided she wanted to make her principal home in New York. And people have described her as that she had almost rock star status there. Taxi cabs would be honking and waving at her. She was on the Larry King show every other night. Scene. But she was here too. Dorothy, who was then, is now the chief of staff for Representative Elliot Neistat, I believe it's churches in his district. She got a call one morning, and Ann could be very abrupt, and she had this way of saying Dorothy, because her other name had been Dorothy, and she'd answer to that until she started high school. Anyway, she went, this Dorothy, I've got this young woman who just doesn't know what to do with her life. I know her father from the car wash board, and I want you to see if we can do anything, find anything over there that will let her have a taste of politics and government. So Dorothy took down the information, and in fact, the young woman wound up being an intern in their office. But after that, they still had this personal relationship, this friendship, and Dorothy said, "Well, how are you doing, Ann?" And her voice changed, and she said, "Well, not so good, because yesterday I was told I was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And her father had died of esophageal cancer. And for all her many flaws, but anything that demonstrates what a good heart she had to me, that the first thing that morning was to make a call to try and help a young person that she didn't know when she had that terrible cloud hanging over her head."
Do we have time for questions?
Yes. Okay. Questions?
Raise your hands high, and we'll take just a few questions. Who's going to be first? Douglas?
This coming week, the Supreme Court may be striking down the Voting Rights Act. I was wondering if you could comment on what Ann Richards might think about that.
Well, she wouldn't like it. I can tell you that. What they're talking about is that when the Voting Rights Act was passed during President Johnson's administration, there were essentially the southern states had such a history of exclusion and racism that they were placed in a separate category. In that if they had a redistricting plan, for example, that had to pass muster with the Justice Department. The other states don't have to do that. Well, so what's going on in that case is that the plaintiffs are saying the time is done. That's all over. Everything's fine now. We don't need to have that provision, the requirement in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and Texas. So that's what it's about. And she would have been out front fighting that.
Well, I have a question. I'll just take that liberty since I'm holding the microphone. I would like to ask you if you think that by being very open about her alcoholism and occasional drug use in the past, that she helped begin to remove some of the stigma for those type of problems and encourage people to seek treatment.
Well, I think so. And one thing she did in specific that my wife was involved in, she thought that it's crazy to have this vast prison system with convicts who were going to be coming out of it, alcoholics or drug addicts. And so she started a system built from scratch and put Dorothy at the head of it to start a treatment program at the prisons. And they went from first to 50th in 2 years, which was quite a chore. And of course, it's since been de-emphasized by the subsequent governors. But yeah, she was brave. She was very brave and open about herself.
We have a question here.
Yes, Jan. If you were going to itemize or prioritize Ann's three most important accomplishments when she was governor, what would you say?
Well, I think the primary accomplishment is that she opened up government. Before it had been an exclusive white guys club. And she nominated blacks and women and Hispanics and gays on their merits. and they performed very well. And that is the lasting part. Even now, though the politics have swung completely away from her politics, if you look at the appointees and the staffs in state government now, that's still carried on. There are still a large representation of minorities in that. The other thing is that she was the first ardent feminist elected to major office in the United States, the very first. And believe me, I checked that out to make sure before I committed to print. Hillary Clinton considered her mentor when she was first lady and senator from New York. So she had a really enlivening effect on women deciding they could seek office and could seek high office. And the third, I think, would be that the consolidation that I spoke of, and improvement of the regulatory agency in charge of overlooking our still very fouled environment.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name?
Marcia Endall Kramer, and I'm not sure if people here are aware that there is an Ann Richards School for girls or young women. I've heard the speech so many times by the wonderful executive director, but it's a public-private school. It's considered a public school.
It's competitive. She discovered a model school like that during her time in New York. There was a school that operated like that, but she really wanted to get that done, and she did. The principal is a wonderful woman and educator named Jean Goka, and Ellen Richards, her younger daughter, is on that board and very much involved in it. And it's I think the first class is now graduating from.
We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Jenny Booth, and I've always wondered, with Ann Richards gone and Molly Ivins gone, who are some other outspoken females to look to today?
One that I hear a lot about is just happens to be my representative, Donna Howard. She's quite a star. And another, over across the way in the Capitol, is a senator from Fort Worth with a fabulous story and a great mind. Her name is Wendy Davis. I think those two, if I were going to say someone could make that leap, women might make that leap. I think those are two I'd point to.
We have a question from Dale Beulah.
When I think of Ann Richards, I see this beautiful, smiling, happy face sitting on this monstrous motorcycle in her white outfit. Was that a stage thing, or was that an insight into a different side of Ann Richards?
Well, it was real, but it was also photoshopped. She proved it. Harley Davidson had given her a small motorcycle, and she learned how to drive it. But our director at Texas Monthly came up with that idea, and he wanted her on the hog, and they couldn't make the schedules work. So he said, "Can you live with it being photoshopped like that?" And everybody loved it. It was talked about at the Clinton National Convention that year. She told my wife, I haven't had thighs like that in 30 years.
Could you take we have like 4 minutes left. Could you take a couple minutes to maybe just give us a few final words, if you wanted to distill into a few words your thoughts and feelings about Ann? Clearly you knew her well.
Okay. As I said, thanks for that, because I was kind of hoping to do something like that. As I said, the greatest pleasure and reward to me as a journalist was discovering these faxes between Ann and Bud Shrake. They were there. They were there for other people to discover and write about when nobody had. And so, to me, it was. They were very private about what their private life was about, but they were public too. You'd see them in the movie theater with people just dazzled by this tall guy and the governor, with popcorn and stuff. But you couldn't. I don't think anybody could read that correspondence and come away thinking those were not love letters. When she died 2 years before Bud. There was a private ceremony in the state cemetery. Lily Tomlin was one of the speakers, but the one that captivated me was what Bud Shrake said. He said, "For the last 17 years, Ann has been the anchor of my life. We don't know what life really is, or where life comes from, or where life goes, or what to do with it while we've got it. But we know life is far grander than just chemistry. We are beings of spirit. And across the divide of death, Ann's spirit remains an echo in our hearts this morning. Father Tolliver says hell is being in heaven and not liking it. I think that's Ann's message to us. Put a smile on your face and a good thought in your heart, and try to do the right thing. And you'll find Ann standing beside you with a fresh bag of popcorn. Thank you, Ann. I love you. Amen. And women, and Ann." They're buried beside each other in the state cemetery. And the title of this book came from her inaugural speech, and it was today we can see what government can accomplish if we just open the doors and let the people in. And but this is right beside her, and it just has his name and dates and tongue-in-cheek motto that was sustained all his life, and that was "So far, so bueno."
Thank you for this very unique opportunity to learn more about Ann Richards, who's truly one of the greatest women Texas has ever produced,
yes,
and just a gem. And so, thank you. We're very grateful to you, Jan.
Thank you. Thank you.